The drought of 1874 had scoured Silver Basin down to the bone. This high Idaho land, never gentle, had turned into a red, cracked skillet sizzling under a white-hot sky. The earth had split open in jagged lines that ran from the creek bed. Now, a ribbon of dry stones, clear to the porch of the only house standing in this narrow valley. Dust, fine as ground pepper and the color of rust, settled on everything. It coated the sagging roof of the barn, silted up the windows of the cabin, and filmed the water left in the barrel with a gritty scum. Wind was the only thing that moved. It came howling down from Dead Man Ridge, a constant, dry-throated rasp that carried no rain, only heat and the smell of distant, dying pines. It tore at the shingles Maeve Hollis had nailed down herself and whipped her hair, the color of dried corn silk, across her face as she fought with the trough. Maeve was 31, though the basin and its hardships had tried to carve another 20 years onto her face. She was a widow, a title that meant little out here except that the work of two now fell on one, and the work was failing. The water trough, cobbled from split logs, had collapsed under the weight of its own dryness. The wood had shrunk, the joints given way, and now she was trying to bind it back together with strips of cured hide, her knuckles raw and bleeding against the splintered timber. Her 2 cows, all that remained of her husband's ambitions, watched from the shade of the barn. Their ribs showed like the hoops of a barrel. Their heads hung low, their breath shallow. They were her last real assets, and they were dying of thirst. A week ago, fire had added its signature to the land's misery. It had swept down the north slope, a roaring wall of orange that had stopped just short of her property line, stalled only by a sudden shift in that damnable wind. The air was still thick with the aftermath, the smell of charred pine resin, sharp and bitter, mingled with the everyday scent of cook smoke and lye soap that clung to her clothes. The barn roof was blackened by the soot, a constant reminder of how close she was to losing the little she had left. She pulled the rawhide strip taut, her muscles screaming in protest. The sun beat on the back of her neck, a physical weight. It was in this heavy, defeated silence that the other sound came, a frantic squawking from the chicken coop. Maeve dropped the rawhide. She didn't think. She moved. Her body knew the economy of survival. Inside the cabin door, the 12-gauge shotgun rested on wooden pegs. Her hand found its smooth, familiar stock. She broke the action, checked the shells a habit, and snapped it shut with a metallic click that was, in its own way, reassuring. She rounded the corner of the cabin at a half-run. A coyote, gaunt and mangy with the desperation of the drought, had its head and shoulders jammed through a rotten plank in the coop. It was snapping at the terrified hens, its yellow eyes wild. It was too hungry to be cautious. Maeve didn't raise the gun to her shoulder. She strode forward, closing the distance, and swung the heavy barrels like a club. The steel cracked against the animal's ribs. The coyote let out a sharp yelp of pain and surprise, scrambling backward, freeing itself. It turned, snarling, its lips pulled back from yellowed teeth. "Get!" Maeve yelled, her voice raw. She levered the gun, the threat clear. The coyote, its bravado broken, tucked its tail and fled, a gray-brown streak vanishing into the red dust and shimmering heat. The chickens continued their hysterical racket. "Shut up," Maeve muttered, lowering the gun. Her heart was hammering, not from fear, but from the dull, familiar anger. Everything was trying to take from her. The sky, the wind, the fire, the predators. She was turning to go back to the trough when she saw him. He was just inside the broken fence line that marked the edge of her property, a place no one ever came. He looked like an apparition, a thing summoned by the heat and the dust. He was tall, far taller than her late husband, and broad, though he was stooped over now, leaning heavily against a fence post as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. He was draped in what looked like a heavy capote made of animal furs, a mad choice in this heat, and it was stiff with grime. Dust clung to him, turning his dark hair and beard a uniform reddish-brown. His left arm was held tight to his side, and the cloth of his shirt, visible beneath the furs, was dark and wet with a stain that wasn't water. A crude bandage was wrapped around his shoulder, soaked through with a brownish-crimson crust. He just stood there, swaying, his head down. Then he raised it, and even from 50 yards, she felt the impact of his gaze. He took one step, then another, lurching toward the cabin. "That's far enough," Maeve's voice cracked across the yard, sharp as a rifle shot. The shotgun came up, this time properly. The stock settled hard against her shoulder. The twin barrels aimed square at his chest. The man froze. He raised one hand, slowly, palm out. It was a massive hand, streaked with dirt and dried blood. He tried to speak, but only a croak came out. He coughed, a dry, racking sound that shook his whole frame, and he winced, grabbing at his wounded shoulder. "Shelter!" he finally managed to rasp. The word was barely audible, swallowed by the wind. He gestures to the battered pack at his feet, then with a groan, unslung it and let it fall to the ground. It landed with a heavy, solid thud. Maeve didn't move. Her eyes flicked past him, up to the ridgeline, scanning the high ground for any sign of others. A lone man was a threat. A man with companions was a death sentence. She saw nothing but heat, shimmer, and rock. "I said stay back," she repeated, her voice lower now, colder. "You've got no business here. Move on." "Can't," he whispered. He leaned heavily on the post, his breathing shallow. "Water. Ain't got water to spare for strangers." The lie tasted like the dust in her mouth. She had water, carefully hoarded in the well, but it was hers. The man stared at her, his eyes shadowed by the brim of a hat that had seen better centuries. He seemed to be making a calculation. Then, with a pained, deliberate slowness, he knelt by his pack. His movements were stiff, agonized. He fumbled with a leather tie. "Get away from the pack," Maeve ordered, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Slow. No weapon." He breathed. "A trade." He pulled the tie loose and the heavy canvas flap fell open. He reached inside, not for a gun, but for something soft. He pulled it out, and then another, and another. He spread them on the ground before him. A fan of dark, glossy fur. Beaver pelts, prime. Winter caught by the looks of them. Thick and lustrous even beneath the coat of dust. Maeve's breath caught. The man laid them out one by one, his movements weakening. He counted them aloud, his voice a dry rasp. 7, 8, 9. He reached in for the last one, his hand shaking violently. 10. He looked up at her, his face pale and slick with sweat beneath the grime. 10 pelts, he said, the words costing him. "For one night, on your floor, and a bucket of water." Maeve stared. The shotgun felt impossibly heavy in her hands. 10 prime beaver pelts. In a drought that had driven the game so far east they might as well be in the next state. 10 pelts was not a trade. It was a fortune. It was flour and sugar for the entire winter. It was seed for the spring, new cartridges for the shotgun, 2 good axes, and enough left over to pay the damn land tax that her husband had left unpaid for 2 seasons. 10 pelts was life. It was a buffer against the wind and the fire. The offer was also insane. It was the bid of a man who was either a fool, a thief, or knew he was dying and was trying to buy his last few hours in the shade. Her mind raced. The pelts were probably stolen. The man who owned them, or the men he stole them from, might be the ones she couldn't see on the ridge. Letting him in was inviting a war to her doorstep. And then there was the other, darker fear. The shadow that lived behind her eyes. Her husband, Jedediah Hollis, had not been a kind man. He had been a man of quick, heavy hands and a meanness that spiked with the whiskey. The last time a stranger, a lost trapper, had stopped for directions, Jedediah had beaten him half to death for smiling at her. And later, he had turned that same rage on her, to teach her, not to invite trouble. This man was bigger than Jedediah. Wounded or not, he was a massive shape. To let him in, to be under the same roof, to be in his power. The man's head slumped. He coughed again. A wet, ugly sound this time, and a fleck of bloody spittle appeared at the corner of his mouth. He was not just wounded. He was sick. He was bleeding out or burning up with fever, or both. Maeve looked from the man to the pelts, then to her 2 skeletal cows. She thought of the coming winter, of the snow piling up against a cabin with no food in it. She thought of the red-inked ledger in the bottom of her trunk, the tax collector's warning. She was balanced on the knife edge of survival, and this man, this dying, dangerous man, had just offered her a way off it. He offered 10 furs for a single night, a night that could cost her everything, but not taking them would also cost her everything. Just slower. Her jaw tightened. She hated this, hated the choice, hated the man for bringing it to her. 1 night, she said, and her own voice sounded foreign to her, hard as nails. The man's head snapped up. Hope, faint and desperate, flickered in his eyes. Maeve lowered the shotgun, but didn't ground it. She walked to the gate, her body rigid, every nerve ending screaming. She lifted the heavy wooden bar. The gate groaned open, scraping a half circle in the dust. "Just the floor," she said, her voice flat and deadly. "And that water." She stepped back, giving him space, but keeping the shotgun ready. "You so much as look at me wrong," Maeve Hollis said to the stranger. "You'll be dead before you hit the ground." He nodded. A jerky, grateful movement. He grasped the fence post and pulled himself to his feet, swaying dangerously. He grabbed his pack, leaving the pelts where they lay in the dust, and staggered through the gateway. Maeve watched him, her face a mask of stone, her mind screaming at what she had just done. She had let the wolf in the door. She closed the gate behind him and slid the bar back into place, the sound final as a hammer on a coffin nail. He made it 6 steps inside the cabin before his legs buckled. The man, the stranger, went down like a felled tree, not collapsing so much as folding in on himself, his good arm bracing his fall just enough to turn it into a ragged heap on the floorboards. His pack, heavy as a sack of rocks, hit the floor by his head with a dull, final thud. For a long second, Maeve didn't move. She stood in the doorway, the shotgun still held in a ready grip, the hot, dusty air at her back and the close, stifling air of the cabin before her. The man lay face down, unmoving. "Mister," she said, her voice sharp. He responded with a low groan, a sound that seemed to be ripped from the very bottom of his lungs. The bargain was for the floor. He was on the floor. Her part of the deal was done. She could leave him there. Let the fever or the bullet wound take him. It would be the smart thing, the safe thing, but the pelts were still outside. She stepped back out, propping the shotgun against the cabin wall, right by the door where she could grab it. Her eyes scanned the ridgeline one last time. Nothing. The sun was a brutal, bleeding orange, just beginning to touch the jagged teeth of the western mountains. She had maybe an hour of light left. She gathered the pelts. They were heavy, rich, the fur thick and impossibly soft under her calloused, cracked hands. This was real. This was a winter of food. She bundled the 10 skins, tied them with a bit of her own rawhide, and dragged the heavy, precious bundle into the barn, hiding it under a pile of rotted hay in the empty stall. She would treat them properly later, when the man was gone, one way or another. When she returned to the cabin, he hadn't moved. The light inside was thick and yellow, full of dancing dust motes. The place was one small room, a life stripped down to its essentials, a cast-iron stove, a dry sink with a bucket beneath it, a rough-hewn table with 1 chair, and her cot in the far corner. In the center, the stone hearth, cold for a month. And the man, a dark, bleeding lump on her floor. "You've got a name?" she asked, nudging his boot with her own. He stirred, slowly, with an agony that seemed to pull at every muscle. He rolled himself over. His face was a mask of sweat, dust, and blood. His beard matted. His eyes, a startling clear gray, found hers in the gloom. They were clouded with fever, unfocused. "Rowan," he rasped. "Rowan Black." And then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again, his breathing turning shallow and fast. Maeve cursed, a low, bitter sound. A dead man with a bullet in him was trouble. A dead man in her cabin was a disaster. The sheriff from Three Cedars, assuming he ever came out this far, would ask questions she couldn't answer. A deal was a deal. She had taken the pelts. She had traded them for a night's shelter. A living man, at least, was part of that bargain. "Damn you," she muttered. To him, to the world. She went to the hearth and, with angry, efficient movements, built a small fire. She filled the heavy iron kettle from her dwindling well bucket and swung it over the flames. While it heated, she gathered her supplies. There was no doctor's bag. She had a tin box where she kept her own meager necessities. She pulled out a spool of dark, waxed fishing silk, a heavy sail needle, a rag, clean but gray with 100 washings, and from the very back of the small food cupboard, hidden behind the cornmeal, a quart bottle of Jedediah's unfinished corn whiskey. She stared at it for a moment. The smell of it always brought back the tightness in her chest, the flinch she still couldn't control. She uncorked it. The sharp, sour smell cut the air. Good, it would sting. And what stung, cleaned. She knelt beside him. "Rowan Black," she said, louder this time. "I'm cutting the shirt." There was no answer. She took the butcher knife from the table, its edge worn but sharp, and slid it carefully under the thick, ruined cloth of his gray shirt. The fabric was stiff, glued to his skin with dried blood. She cut it away, from his waist up to his collar, laying the skin bare. The wound was ugly. It was a dark, puckered hole high on the left side of his chest, near the shoulder, and another, larger and more ragged, on his back. A clean shot, straight through. He was lucky, or unlucky, depending on how it was measured. It had missed the bone, and by the lack of bright, frothy blood, it had missed his lung, but it was infected. The edges were swollen, an angry purple, and the smell that rose from it was the sweet, sick smell of corruption. Her hands, chapped and split from fighting the trough, were surprisingly steady. She dipped the rag into the now steaming kettle and began to clean the grime from his skin, working her way toward the wound. He was built like the land, all hard plains and ridges, his skin browned by the sun, scarred in a dozen other places. When she touched the edge of the wound itself, he woke up. It wasn't a gentle waking. It was a violent, galvanic surge of life. His eyes snapped open, blazing with a wild, animal panic. With a roar, his good right hand shot out and seized her wrist, his fingers clamping down with crushing, impossible strength. Maeve screamed, a short, sharp cry of pain and shock. The steel trap grip cut off the blood to her hand, the force of it driving her own bones together. She was trapped. He was delirious, strong, and he had her. The panic she had held at bay for years, the old, familiar terror of being held down, of being hurt by a man's strength, surged in her throat like bile. But Maeve Hollis was not the woman Jedediah had married. She was the woman who had buried him. She did not pull. She did not fight. She froze, her body going utterly still. She looked from his hand, clamped on her arm, up to his wild, fever-bright eyes. She pushed her own fear down until it was a cold, hard stone in her belly. "Let go," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was low, flat, and cold as the water in the well. His eyes stared, unseeing. He was breathing in great, ragged gasps, his knuckles white where he held her. "My name is Maeve," she said, her voice even, cutting through his delirium. "You are in my cabin. You are hurt. I am trying to fix you." She leaned in, her face inches from his. "If you want to keep that arm, you will lie still. If you break my wrist, you will bleed out on my floor." She held his gaze, pouring all of her will, all the granite strength of this valley, into that look. For a moment, he fought her, his mind trapped in whatever hell he was reliving. Then, a flicker of understanding, a sliver of the man behind the fever. His breath hitched, the wildness in his eyes faded, just a fraction, replaced by a vast, confused pain. His fingers uncurled, one by one. The release was so sudden her hand fell limp at her side, throbbing, a constellation of white fingerprints on her skin. Rowan Black groaned, his head falling back against the floorboards, his eyes closing. "Sit," Maeve commanded, her voice still hard, though her heart was hammering like a trapped bird. "Sit up, if you can. I have to clean the back." He obeyed, or tried to. He pushed himself up with his good arm, swaying, his teeth clenched so hard she could hear them grinding. She shoved her own body behind him, bracing his uninjured side, her shoulder against his back. He was burning. His skin radiated a heat that was frightening, a dry, consuming fire. "This will hurt," she said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. She poured the corn whiskey. It was not a scream he gave, but a deep, guttural sound, a tearing of air from a body pushed beyond its limits. His entire frame went rigid, muscles locking like stone. He arched back, his head thrown against her shoulder, his jaw wide in a silent howl. Maeve held him, her own body unyielding, and poured again, flushing the exit wound, the raw alcohol washing away the filth. The cabin filled with the acrid stench of whiskey and sweat, a sharp counterpoint to the smoky, resinous smell of the pine logs. She could feel his heart hammering against her, or perhaps it was her own. When it was done, he slumped against her, a dead weight, his breath coming in whistling sobs. She eased him back down, his head resting on the rolled-up canvas of his pack. She threaded the sail needle with the fishing silk. Her hands were shaking now, a fine tremor. She took a breath, held it, and let it out slow. The first stitch was the worst. She pierced the skin, and he flinched, but he was too far gone to fight. She worked methodically. Stitch, pull, knot, stitch, pull, knot. Her hands, so clumsy with the rawhide on the trough, were deft and precise. She lost herself in the rhythm, in the small, focused task. The only sound in the cabin, the quiet, wet pull of the silk through flesh and the pop and crackle of the fire. He began to mutter. At first, it was just noise, the senseless syllables of a man in deep fever. But then, words, fragments. "Kincaid, no, don't let him, don't let it burn." Maeve's hand stilled for a second. Kincaid, the name was nothing to her. She kept sewing. "The map," he breathed, his voice desperate, pleading with some phantom in the firelight. "They burned the map is safe. Don't let it burn." She tied off the last knot and cut the silk with her knife. A secret. His fever was spilling secrets. Secrets were a currency more dangerous than pelts. She filed the words away, Kincaid. Map, burn. She tore a long strip from the clean rag and bandaged him, wrapping the cloth tight around his shoulder and chest, front to back. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels. Her knees popped, her back ached, her wrist throbbed. She stood and retrieved a thin, scratchy wool blanket from her cot. She did not put him on the cot. She laid the blanket on the floor, a good 5 paces from the hearth, a clear, deliberate distance from her own sleeping space. She grabbed his pack and put it by his head. Then she filled a tin cup with water from her bucket and set it beside him. The deal was fulfilled. Night had fallen completely. The drought had killed the night sounds, leaving a silence that was heavy, oppressive. Maeve checked the bar on her door. It was heavy, thick. She added a log to the fire, just enough to keep the shadows at bay. She lay down on her cot, on her side, facing him. She didn't bother to undress, just kicked off her heavy boots. The shotgun was on its wooden pegs, high on the wall, just above her head. She reached up, her fingers finding the smooth, cool-grained wood of the stock. She didn't take it down, but she kept her hand there. The firelight threw dancing shadows across the cabin. It caught the planes of the stranger's face, with the dirt and blood washed away. He was younger than she had first thought, not a boy, but not an old man. His beard was dark, but his hair had lighter streaks, and the lines around his eyes and mouth were deep, carved not just by the sun, but by something else, by living, by running. She saw it then, in the way his brow was furrowed even in his fevered sleep, the way his mouth was set. It wasn't just pain, it was a familiar, hounded look, a guilt that ran so deep it had settled in his bones. It was a look she knew well. She had seen it in the mirror every morning for the first year after Jedediah was gone. A guilt for surviving. This man's guilt felt different. Newer, but just as heavy. Just one night, she whispered to the shadows, the words a promise to herself. But her eyes stayed open, fixed on the stranger. She watched the slow, agonized rise and fall of his chest, each breath a small battle, and she waited. Maeve awoke stiffly, her hand still curled where it had rested on the shotgun's stock. The gray, pre-dawn light that filtered through the cabin's single grimy window was just enough to see. Her neck was cramped, her eyes gritty from a night spent balanced on the edge of sleep. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The ragged, fevered breathing that had filled the small space was gone. She sat up, swinging her feet to the cold floorboards, her hand moving from the gun to the wall to steady herself. He was awake, the man. Rowan Black was propped up on his good elbow, his back against the wall. His pack was open beside him. He had drunk the water in the tin cup. The fever had broken. His skin was no longer flushed and dry, but pale and slick with a drenching sweat that plastered his dark hair to his skull. His eyes, no longer wild and clouded, were fixed on her. They were clear, gray as a winter sky, and held a weary, painful intelligence. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Maeve's first instinct was to grab the gun. He was no longer a helpless, dying animal. He was a man, awake, and she was alone with him. He broke the silence first. His voice was a low, cracked rasp, but the delirium was gone. "You've got a clean hand with a needle," he said. He gestured with a nod of his head toward his bandaged shoulder. "Thank you." Maeve just stared, her face giving nothing away. Thanks were a luxury she didn't trade in. "The night's over." "It is," he agreed. He looked past her, through the open cabin door, at the red-dusted yard and the collapsed water trough, stark and broken in the morning's harsh light. "Your trough is stove in." "I'm aware." Her voice was flat. "I've got no more pelts," he said, his gaze returning to her. "And the fever, it laid me out longer than I figured. I'm guessing that one night deal is spent." "It is. I can't pay for another, but I can't move on, not just yet." He pushed himself up a little straighter, a wince of sharp pain tightening his face. "But I can work. I'm fair with wood. Let me fix the trough. I'll earn a few more days, just till I can stand proper." Maeve's eyes narrowed. This was a new bargain. The first had been desperate, an exchange of treasure for a few hours of life. This was different. This was an arrangement. It meant he would be here. Not just on her floor, but in her yard, moving, working, existing in her space. Her mind screamed no. He was trouble. The name Kincaid and the fevered mutter about a map were still etched in her memory. He was running from something, and whatever it was, it would find him, and her. But she looked at the trough. She thought of her bleeding knuckles, the rawhide strips that wouldn't hold. She thought of the 2 cows in the barn, their tongues beginning to swell. She couldn't fix it, not alone, not well enough to last. She was trapped, and he knew it. He had seen her weakness, and it wasn't her fear of him. It was the broken wood in her yard. "Fine," she said, the word clipped. "You fix the trough, you make it solid." She pointed a finger at him, the nail broken and caked with dirt. "But there's rules, my rules." He waited, his gray eyes unblinking. "First, you stay out of the cabin unless I say, you sleep in the barn. It's empty." "Fair." He nodded. "Second, we don't talk." "I don't want to know your name. I don't want to know where you came from. And I don't want to know what map you are crying about." His face went utterly still. The mention of the map was a cold stone dropped into a deep well. His eyes hardened, just for a second, before he masked it. "And third," she pushed on, "when the trough is done, and my cows are watered, you take your pack, and you go. We're square. No matter what's on that ridge, you go." He held her gaze. "The work will be slow," he said, indicating his shoulder. "Then you'd best start." She said. She turned her back on him, a calculated risk, and walked to the stove to make coffee. The bargain was set. He was as good as his word, and as weak as he looked. It took him half the morning just to get from the cabin to the barn, his movements stiff and agonizing. Maeve watched him from the window, her hands kneading dough for breakfast bread with a vicious energy. He was a big man, broad-shouldered even with the wound, and he moved with a contained, deliberate slowness that was the mark of a man used to hard country. He found her husband's old tools in the barn, rusted but serviceable. A hammer, a saw, a spade. He spent the first hour just sitting, sharpening the saw blade with a file from his own pack. Then the sound began. It was a new rhythm for the homestead. For a year, Silver Basin had been defined by silence, broken only by the shriek of the wind, the lowing of the cows, or the solitary, dull thud of Maeve's own axe. Now, there was a man's work, the rasp of the saw blade against dry wood, the careful, measured tap-tap-tap of the hammer, then a solid thwack as a post was set. It was not the angry, splintering sound of Jedediah's rages, the sound of a chair being broken or a fist hitting a wall. This was a steady, constructive sound, a sound of mending. It set Maeve's teeth on edge. They existed in this new, fragile orbit for 2 days. They did not speak, adhering to her rule, but language was not limited to words. Their communication became a silent, efficient choreography. When he stood by the well, his good arm unable to work the heavy bucket, she came out, shouldered him aside without a word, and drew 2 buckets. She left one for him, and carried one for herself. When he was wrestling a heavy, warped piece of old roofing tin, trying to flatten it into a liner for the trough, she appeared at his side. He just nodded at the far end. She grabbed the sharp, rusted edge, her hands protected by a rag, and they pulled against each other. A silent, straining tug of war until the metal groaned and flattened. He'd nod. Bucket. She'd fetch it. She'd point. Rope. He'd get the one she meant. When he was trying to line up a post, his left arm useless, he'd grunt in frustration. She would step in, take the level from his hand, and hold the post steady. Now, she'd say, he'd hammer, in these small, shared tasks. Their eyes met. His gaze was direct, stripped of the fever's fog. It was heavy with things unsaid gratitude, pain, and a deep, wary assessment. He watched her. He saw the strength in her hands, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the way she flinched if his hammer struck too suddenly. She watched him. His hands were huge, crisscrossed with a web of white scars, the knuckles busted. They were the hands of a fighter, a brawler. Yet his work was meticulous. He didn't just patch the trough, he rebuilt it. He squared the joints. He dug new post holes, deeper than the originals. He made it better. He made it last. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the trough was done. It was ugly, a patchwork of old wood and rusted tin, but it was rock solid and it was full, the water from her well gleaming in its new bed. The 2 cows drank, their sides heaving, for a solid 10 minutes. The deal was over. He had to go. The sun was a copper weight in the sky, the heat pressing down, suffocating. The cabin was an oven. Maeve, sticky with sweat, her hair matted with dust and pine resin, longed for the simple, forgotten luxury of being clean. She took the half-empty bucket of well water, her last clean rag, and a bar of lye soap. She went to the clothesline that stretched between 2 posts behind the cabin. From her bed, she pulled the thin, rough-spun sheet and hung it, creating a flimsy, 3-sided screen. It was a pathetic pretense of privacy. The sheet was thin, the afternoon sun behind her. She knew, with a sick certainty, exactly what it would show. Rowan was sitting on the bench outside the barn, his back to the wall, his eyes closed, supposedly resting. He was 50 yards away. Maeve hesitated. She could wait until dark, but the dark was his, and this was hers. She unbraided her hair, her movements stiff with defiance. She ducked behind the sheet. She dipped the rag in the bucket and began to wash, scrubbing the grime from her face, her neck, her arms. Then, she took the soap and worked it into her thick hair. She poured the cool water over her head. the relief of it making her gasp. She tipped her head back, letting the water run down her back, and stood for a moment, just breathing. She was a shadow, and she knew it. The sun, slanting low, would be turning her into a dark, clear silhouette against the pale fabric. The outline of her head, the curve of her arm as she raised it, the line of her throat. She opened her eyes and glanced toward the barn. He was watching, his head was up, his gray eyes fixed, not on the barn wall, but on her, on the sheet. He was perfectly still. He was seeing her. A hot, familiar shame washed over her, followed by a spike of pure rage. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to look away, to throw the bucket at him. This was what men did. They looked, they took. But then, as she watched, he did something she did not expect. He slowly, deliberately, turned his head. He broke the gaze, not in guilt, not as if caught, but with a quiet, conscious motion. He turned and looked away, out toward the empty, heat-blasted ridge, giving her back her privacy. He just gave it back. Maeve stood frozen behind the sheet, her hair dripping cold water down her back. Her heart was doing a strange, heavy beat against her ribs. Jedediah would have stared. He would have whistled. He would have made a comment, crude and possessive. And then he would have come, pulling the sheet down, his eyes hot and his hands hard. Rowan Black had looked, and then he had looked away. The feeling that flooded her was so foreign she couldn't name it. It was a terrifying, confusing warmth that started in her chest. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen as a woman, and yet not being threatened, of being acknowledged, and yet, in the same moment, being respected. It was a sliver of light, a drop of clean water in a desert of gravel and stone. It was more dangerous than his fever, more threatening than his wound. She finished washing, her hands clumsy. She pulled the pins from her hair and wrung it out. When she was done, she took a deep breath and pulled the sheet from the line. She folded it, her movements precise, her face set. He was still sitting on the bench, his profile to her. He had not moved. He was still watching the ridge, as if giving her all the time in the world to be finished, to be covered, to be safe. She walked back to the cabin. The distance between them, the 5 paces she had drawn on the floorboards, the 50 yards of dust and heat, had not changed, but the space that separated them had altered. Quietly, irrevocably. It was no longer a boundary. It was a threshold. The trough was full, a dark, gleaming mirror reflecting the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The cows, their thirst finally sated, stood nearby, their breath deep and contented. The deal was done. Maeve stood on the cabin's small porch, her arms crossed, her damp hair coiled tightly at the base of her neck. The air had cooled, but the tension was thicker than the heat had ever been. Rowan was still on the bench by the barn, but he was no longer resting. He was repacking his bag. His movements were still pained, his left arm held close to his body, but the weakness was gone, replaced by a grim, methodical purpose. He was preparing to leave. He was honoring the bargain. "The trough is solid," she called out, her voice cutting the quiet. It was not a thank you. It was an acknowledgement of a completed transaction. "You held up your end." He stopped, his hand halfway into his pack. He looked up at her across the darkening yard. "I did. So you'll be going," she said. It was not a question. He pulled his hand back, his shoulders slumping, just for a moment, under a weight that had nothing to do with his wound. That was the deal. "But you can't, can you?" she said, her voice dropping. "You're not just moving on. You're running." He went still. His head came up, his gray eyes unreadable in the dusk. "That's my business. We had a rule, no questions." "You made that rule before you had a name," she shot back. "Before you started yelling it in your sleep." She stepped off the porch, one step, then another, closing half the distance between them. "Kincaid, you were yelling about a man named Kincaid, and a map. You told someone not to let the map burn." His body language changed. The weary traveler vanished, and something harder, more dangerous, took its place. He straightened up from the bench, his good hand unconsciously moving to his belt, where a heavy knife she had not seen before was sheathed. "You should have let that part of the bargain lie, Maeve," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's too late for that," she said, her own fear making her angry. "You brought it into my house. You bled it onto my floor. You're not just a wounded trapper, are you? Who is Otis Kincaid?" Rowan studied her, his gaze sharp and assessing. He was deciding if she was a threat, a liability, or something else. Finally, he gave a short, bitter sigh, a sound of profound exhaustion. "He's the man who's trying to kill me," he said, "and he's the man who's going to own this whole basin if someone doesn't stop him." He sat back down. The motion pained. He looked at his own scarred hands. "I'm a guide, or I was. I know this territory. Every rock and dry creek. I was hired to lead a freight wagon, a big one, for the railroad brokers, full of mining equipment, payroll, real money. We were hit in the pass, north of Dead Man Ridge." He touched his shoulder. "This is where they paid me for my trouble." "A robbery," Maeve said. "A setup," Rowan corrected, his voice full of acid. "The robbers knew the route. They knew the guard rotation. They knew exactly where to be. And when it was over, I was the only one left alive. The company men found me 3 days later, next to a confession I'd supposedly written, with a bullet in my shoulder and a bag of payroll gold at my feet. They framed you." "Otis Kincaid framed me," Rowan said, his voice flat. "He was the broker. He organized the shipment. He organized the robbery. He gets the insurance. He gets the payroll. And he gets a clean trail by putting a bounty on the head of his murderous guide. He wants me dead to keep the secret buried." "But why?" Maeve asked, frowning. "A payroll. That's not this." She waved her hand at the parched, dying valley. "No," Rowan agreed. "That was just the seed money. Kincaid doesn't want the payroll. He wants the land. He wants all of Silver Basin. He's been buying up debt, forcing foreclosures. But to own the basin, you have to own the one thing that matters." "The water," Maeve whispered, the word tasting like ash. "The water," Rowan confirmed. "He's choking it off. He's been buying rights upriver, damming tributaries under false pretenses. He's creating the drought, or at least making it 10 times worse. He's trying to break this valley, break the ranchers, the homesteaders. Buy it all for pennies on the dollar when they're finally starved out." A cold, heavy stone dropped in Maeve's stomach. A name, whispered in a fever. A name, tied to a plan. She turned without a word and stalked back into the cabin. He didn't follow. She went to the old sea chest at the foot of her cot, the one that held her few good linens and all of Jedediah's failures. She dug beneath the blankets, her hand closing on a thick, leather-bound ledger. She carried it to the table, her hands shaking slightly, and lit the oil lamp. The small, yellow flame threw her shadow, huge and distorted, against the wall. She flipped through the brittle, brown-inked pages. Jedediah's clumsy accounts, debts, more debts. And then she found it. The handwriting was not her husband's. It was a precise, elegant script. Loan against future earnings, Silver Basin property. And the name, signed with a flourish. Otis Kincaid, railroad land broker. It was a small loan, but the interest noted beside it was monstrous, a rate that would double the debt every 6 months. And then, at the bottom of the page, a penciled note, added later. In that same precise hand, it was as if Kincaid had been auditing his own malice. "Hollis property is key, water access, though he is blind to it. We'll call the debt when the basin cracks. This drought is our friend." Maeve stared at the words until they blurred. This drought is our friend. She had thought the fire was the enemy. She had thought the wind, the lack of rain, the coyote. She had thought nature was her foe. But it was a man in a suit, with a precise hand, sitting in an office in some distant town. She looked up as Rowan filled the doorway, his large frame blocking the last of the light. He had not been able to stay outside. He had seen her face. She didn't speak. She just pointed a trembling finger at the name in the book. He came forward, leaning over the table. The lamplight caught the fresh sewn stitches on his shoulder and the deep lines of his face. He read the entry. He read the note. He looked at her, and in that moment, the entire world shifted. He was no longer a stranger. She was no longer a widow, isolated in her grief and her struggle. They were 2 points on the same map, with the same enemy drawing a circle around them. "He's hunting you," Maeve said, her voice hollow. "And he's strangling me." "So he's the one," Rowan said, his voice quiet. "The one who held the paper on your husband." "My husband was a fool," Maeve said, closing the book with a heavy thud. "And a brute. But he didn't deserve this. No one does." She looked at Rowan. "Your bargain. The 1 night for 10 pelts? That's done. Your new bargain, the trough for a few days? That's done, too. Maeve, your deal is over. Rowan Black, you're free to go." She met his gaze, her own as hard as the baked earth outside. "But mine is just starting. He's not taking this land. I buried 1 man on this property. I will not let another one, a stranger, take it from me." He watched her, a slow, deep understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw the shift in her, the fear turning to a cold, hard rage. "You can't fight him alone. Maeve, he's got money, and he's got guns." "And what do you have?" she countered. "You've got a bounty on your head and a hole in your shoulder, and a secret, a map you were screaming about. A map Kincaid would want." He straightened up, his hand unconsciously touching his pack. "The map? He thinks I have it." "And do you?" "No," Rowan said. "He does. Or he thinks he does. When they hit the wagon, I knew it was a setup. I had the real map, my guide charts in my bag. I had a fake, a decoy, in the payroll box. While they were shooting, I set fire to the decoy. That's what I was yelling about, making sure it burned, making sure they thought the real one was destroyed. But the real one is in here," he said, his voice dropping. He didn't tap his pack. He tapped his head. "I'm the map. I'm the only one who knows this basin. The only one who knows what Kincaid is really after. It's not just the river, Maeve. It's what's under the ground." He grabbed a burnt stick from the cold hearth and knelt, brushing the dust on the floorboards clean. "Look, this is the basin. This is the main river. The one Kincaid is choking. But he's wrong. The old-timers, the Shoshone, they didn't follow the river. They followed the seeps. With the charcoal." He drew a series of lines, like veins, branching off an invisible spine. "There's a whole other river under our feet, an underground system. It comes up in hidden places, seeps, springs. You just have to know where to look. And Kincaid wants it," Maeve said. "He wants the source. He wants the one place it all comes together. He thinks I have the map to it." Rowan's face was grim in the lamplight. "And I do." He drew a circle on his crude map. "It's a place the old ones called Willow Fork. It's not a fork in the river. It's a spring, a big one. But it's hidden. It's covered by a century of dead grass, a thick, matted layer of it. You could walk right over it and never know." He looked up at her, his eyes intense. The fire that almost took you. It came down this ridge," he said, his finger tracing a line. "It burned all the sagebrush, all the heavy timber. But a fire like that moves fast. It would have skipped over the mat. It would have just scorched the top, left it dry as tinder." Maeve saw it. She saw the plan, desperate and terrifying, forming in his mind. "If we burn it," he said, his voice low, urgent, "if we set a small, controlled fire on that mat, it will burn down to the mud. It will expose the spring. It would be enough, Maeve, enough water to fill your trough, enough to water your cows, enough, maybe, to save this whole valley, to show everyone that Kincidin's drought is a lie. The one-night bargain was a distant memory. This was a new, unspoken pact, a plan." "I'll do it," Maeve said, her voice quiet, but with a new, dangerous edge. "I'll light the fire. I'm not going to burn my house down. I'm going to burn the grass that's hiding our water." The promise hung in the air between them, unspoken but binding. If they succeeded, Silver Basin would survive. If they failed, they would both be ashes. There was no moon. The stars, brilliant and cold in the blackness, offered no light, only a vast, indifferent glitter. The wind had died, leaving the air heavy and still, as if the basin were holding its breath. Maeve moved through the darkness like a shadow herself. A 5-gallon can of kerosene, nearly full, was slung over her good shoulder. The wire handle wrapped in a rag to keep it from slicing into her hand. The weight was brutal, a burning, dead-tired ache that pulled at her spine. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the pair of dark, scuffed boots moving just ahead of her. Rowan led the way, his only tool the spade he'd used to fix the trough, now employed as a walking stick. He leaned on it heavily with his good arm. His body canted at an awkward angle to protect his wounded shoulder. Every third or fourth step, she heard the sharp, hitched intake of his breath as the movement tore at his stitches. He did not groan. He did not complain. He just kept moving, a tall, limping silhouette against the star-pricked line of the ridge. They were climbing Dead Man Ridge, not the face, but the gentler, fire-scorched northern slope. The ground was a treacherous landscape of charcoal and ash, slippery and unstable. The smell of the old fire was still strong, a bitter, dusty perfume. "How much further?" Maeve whispered, her voice swallowed by the darkness. "Half a mile," he rasped, not looking back. "It'll be a flat, wide-open spot. The ground will feel soft, spongy, even now." He was navigating by memory, by the feel of the land under his feet. He was the map. They walked in silence for another 20 minutes, a punishing, heart-pounding climb. Finally, Rowan stopped. He stamped his boot. The sound was dull, not the sharp thud of baked earth or the crunch of rock, but a muffled, hollow thump. "This is it," he breathed. "Willow Fork." Maeve eased the kerosene can to the ground, her shoulders screaming in relief. She looked around. It was no different from any other part of the ridge. Just a wide, blackened patch of nothing. But he was right. The ground under her own boots felt different. It was firm, but with a slight, peaty give, like a carpet laid over the rock. "The wind," Rowan said, his head tilted, listening to the night. "It's still good. It should draw straight up the ridge if it kicks up." He pointed with the spade. "We make 3, one here, one 20 yards that way, one 20 yards there, a triangle. We light the middle one first, then the edges." Maeve uncapped the can. The pungent smell of the kerosene cut through the scent of old ash. "This is madness," she said, her voice low. "It is," he agreed, his face a set of pale planes in the starlight. "Pour." She doused 3 spots, the liquid vanishing instantly into the thick, dry mat. She kicked a small trench in the ash between them, a crude fire break, though she knew if the wind turned, it would be useless. Rowan knelt, his back to her, and fumbled in his pack. He pulled out a small, waterproof tin. Inside, a flint and steel. "Stand back," he said. He struck the steel, a small, sharp spark. Then another. The third spark caught the tinder he'd prepared. A tiny flame, no bigger than her thumb, sprang to life. He shielded it with his body, feeding it a twist of dry rotted canvas from his pack until it held. Then he stood, took the burning canvas, and tossed it onto the center patch of kerosene. The ground erupted. It was not a fire, but a whoosh of blue-orange flame that leapt 6 feet in the air, a roar that shattered the night's silence. It burned with a ferocious, oily hunger. Rowan was already moving, lighting a long branch from the first fire and loping, stiff-legged, to the other 2 spots. He touched the flame to them. Whoosh, whoosh. A wall of fire, 30 yards wide, and was suddenly in front of them. The heat was a physical blow, driving them back. "It's working." Rowan yelled over the roar. The fire was not spreading outward. It was burning down. The thick, ancient mat of grass, dry as bone on top from the forest fire but still dense below, was consuming itself. A column of thick, acrid, oily smoke billowed straight up into the night, momentarily blotting out the stars. Then the choking began. The smoke was not the clean scent of pine. It was the smell of 1,000 years of compressed vegetation, and it was foul. It tore at their lungs, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Maeve doubled over, coughing, her eyes streaming, the tears cutting clean tracks through the soot that already coated her face. Her lungs felt as if they were full of hot gravel. Rowan was on one knee, his head down, his body racked by deep, painful coughs that she knew must be agony for his shoulder. They were blinded, choked, and deafened by their own creation. For 5 minutes, the world was nothing but heat, smoke, and a terrible, roaring sound. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the fuel was gone. The roar died. The flames sank, guttering, from 6 feet to 1 foot to nothing, leaving a vast, glowing carpet of red-orange embers. The silence that fell was shocking, heavier than before. The smoke began to rise, to clear. Maeve was on her hands and knees, gasping for clean air. Her eyes burned so badly she could barely open them. "Listen," Rowan rasped, his voice a raw whisper. She froze. She listened. The wind was still. The coyotes were silent. The only sound was the crackle of the embers. And something else, a sound so foreign she almost didn't recognize it, a quiet ticking, a hiss, a sound like rain on a tin roof. But it wasn't raining. Rowan staggered to his feet. He grabbed the spade. He walked out onto the carpet of embers, his boots sinking to his ankles, the heat scorching, but he didn't seem to notice. He stood in the center, his head cocked. "There!" he breathed. He drove the spade down. The embers hissed and flew. He struck soft, wet mud. He dug again. A frantic, desperate motion, using his one good arm, leveraging his body weight. The ticking sound became a gurgle. He dug again, and a spray of black mud and steam shot from the hole. And then it came, a seep of dark, clear water. It bubbled up from the hole he'd made, washing the ash from the embers, spreading, finding its own level. It wasn't a geyser. It wasn't a river. It was a small, steady, persistent flow. Rowan dug a frantic channel, his breath coming in great, sobbing gasps, pulling the water away from the springhead, giving it a path. It followed, a small, determined trickle of life. Maeve got to her feet. She walked toward him, her legs unsteady. She stopped at the edge of the new, shallow ditch he was carving. The water, no wider than her hand, was flowing. It was real. It was dark, and it smelled of deep earth and old stone, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Rowan looked up at her, his face black with soot, his eyes mad with triumph, his teeth a white slash in the dark. And Maeve Hollis did something she hadn't done since Jedediah died. She laughed. It was not a polite sound. It was a raw, rusty, cracked sound, half cough, half sob, that was ripped from her chest. It was the sound of a dam breaking. Rowan stared at her, and his own frantic energy seemed to stop. A slow, stunned smile spread across his face. She knelt at the head of the tiny stream. She dipped her hands in the water. It was cool, not icy, but cool. She brought her cupped hands to her face, washing away the soot, the tears, the smoke. She drank. It was sweet. Rowan came and knelt beside her. He did the same, plunging his face into the flow, coming up sputtering, water streaming from his hair and beard. They knelt there for a long moment, the silence broken only by the sound of the gurgling spring, their private miracle. The relief was a physical thing, a weight lifting that left them both lightheaded, trembling. He turned his head. She turned hers. They were inches apart, their faces streaked with mud and ash, their hair singed. The red-orange glow of the embers lit them, a warm, intimate light. His gaze was heavy. It held the fire, the smoke, the water, and something else, a shared, dangerous understanding. He did not move. He just looked at her, and she felt that look, that respectful, acknowledging gaze, clear to her bones. She found herself leaning in, Just a fraction. He saw it. His hand, the good one, caked with mud, came up. He didn't grab. He didn't take. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed her jaw, his thumb coming to rest on her chin. He lifted her face, just slightly. His eyes were asking the question. He would not ask with words. He would not cross that line unless she invited him. Maeve's heart was a hammer. Her breath caught in her throat. She was terrified. Not of him, of this, of the warmth that was spreading through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every second to pull away. She did not. His lips touched hers. It was not a desperate, hungry kiss. It was a kiss of shared survival. It was slow and chaste and monumentally gentle. His lips were chapped, tasting of smoke and earth and the new water. His beard was rough against her skin. Her hands, of their own accord, came up, not to push him away, but to rest on his chest, on the solid, living warmth of him. His good hand moved from her chin to the back of her neck, his fingers lacing into her damp hair. Not pulling, just holding. He trembled, or she did. She couldn't tell. He deepened the kiss, just slightly, his lips parting hers, a quiet, hesitant exploration. It was a question, and a promise, and a statement, all in one. It was 1,000 times more intimate than anything Jedediah had ever demanded of her. And then he pulled back, just an inch. His forehead came to rest against hers. They stayed like that, their breath mingling, a cloud of steam in the cool night air. Their eyes closed. "Don't rush," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against her skin. His breath was warm on her lips. "We have tomorrow." He was right. This was too fast, too much, too soon. But it was also the only thing that made sense. He pulled back further, his hand lingering on her neck before falling away. The space between them felt charged, electric. They stood, their bodies aching, their lungs raw, but their minds clear. The pact was sealed, not with a bargain, but with a burn and a kiss. "We need to protect it," Maeve said, her voice shaky, but practical. The spell was broken. "Aye," he agreed. He picked up the spade. "We need to bank the sides, make sure the flow is clean, and mark it. We need to find this place again in the light." For the next hour, they worked as a team, building a small, protective wall of rock and mud around the spring's head, deepening the channel, guiding the precious, narrow stream down the slope. Rowan was driving the spade into the earth to mark the head when he suddenly froze. "What?" Maeve said, her heart lurching. He put a hand on her arm. A silent command. He was looking, not at her, not at the spring, but far down, toward the valley, toward the town of 3 Cedars. Maeve followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing, just the vast, dark bowl of the basin. Then, she saw it. 2 small, bouncing lights, yellow, unmistakable, horse lanterns. They were moving, and they were moving fast. They were not on the main track. They were cutting across the open range, heading straight for Deadman Ridge, straight for the column of smoke that was, even now, rising into the sky. "Kincaid's men," Rowan said, his voice a flat, dead thing. The man who had kissed her was gone, replaced by the hunted guide. "That'll be Fitch and Dorian Lyle. They've seen the fire." The lanterns were no longer distant. They were close, bouncing with the hard, fast gait of horses being pushed. "Down!" Rowan's voice was not a whisper. It was a sharp, hard command that sliced through the night. The man from the spring was gone, replaced by the hunted guide. He didn't wait for her to obey. His good hand clamped around her arm, and he hauled her, stumbling, off the glowing embers and into the deep shadows. "The rocks," he hissed, pointing. "The cleft. Stay low." Maeve's heart, which had just begun to slow, seized in her chest. She had the shotgun. She must have, she thought, her mind racing. She felt the hard wood of the stock, cold against her back. She had slung it over her shoulder before they left. A silent, necessary precaution. They scrambled, their boots slipping on the ash-slicked rock. Rowan pushed her behind a jagged outcrop of granite, a natural wall that looked like broken teeth. They pressed themselves flat into the cleft, their bodies crushed together in the narrow space. The rock was cold, and it bit into her palms. All she could hear was the frantic hammering of her own blood and Rowan's ragged, painful breathing next to her ear. He put a single, dirt-caked finger to his lips, his eyes wide and alert, the jingle of a harness, the thud of hooves on hard earth, slowing to a walk, and then, voices. "Whoa up, Fitch! This is the place. Smell it." The voice was coarse, unwelcoming. "I smell smoke. Lyle, that's all I smell. Kincaid's gonna have our hides for riding out on a fool's errand." This voice was flatter, more tired. "It ain't no fool's errand. Look!" The sound of a boot hitting the ground. Then another. Through a narrow gap between the rocks, Maeve could see them. Two men, silhouetted against the dying red glow of the spring. They were built large, with long dusters and hats pulled low. One, the one called Lyle, knelt, his hand hovering over the embers. "It's hot," Lyle said, a note of surprise in his voice. "And look here, mud, real wet mud." He scooped a handful, his laugh a wet, ugly sound. "Well, I'll be damned. The boss said this whole basin was cracked dry. And look at this, water. Tracks," Fitch said, his voice sharp. He pointed. "2 sets. Those big ones? That's Black. I'd know that worn-down heel print anywhere. He's here. And the other one?" Lyle stood, his gaze sweeping the darkness. "Smaller. A lot smaller. A woman's boot." His eyes scanned the rocks, probing the darkness. Maeve held her breath, her body rigid. He was looking right at them. He couldn't see them. He couldn't. Lyle's head tilted. He took a step toward their hiding place. Well, Fitch," he drawled, his voice pitched to Carrie. "It looks like our boy Black, our wanted murderer, found himself a little prairie hen to keep his bed warm." He spat into the embers, the sound a sharp hiss. "Hope she ain't as dry as the rest of this valley." A cold, slimy sickness flooded Maeve's stomach. It was Jedediah's voice. It was the voice of the man in the saloon who had grabbed her arm. It was every crude, leering word that had ever tried to shrink her, to make her nothing but a thing to be used. The old, familiar terror, the instinct to curl up, to disappear, washed over her. Her hands began to tremble, but the hand that was trembling was the one on the rock. The one gripping the smooth, worn stock of the 12-gauge was steady. She felt the tremor pass through her, and she pushed it down. She had faced the coyote. She had stitched a man's life together. She had just brought water from a stone. She was not Jedediah's wife anymore. She straightened her spine, a small, defiant movement in the dark. She lifted her chin, her eyes turning cold as the rock she leaned against. Rowan felt the shift beside him. He felt the trembling stop, replaced by a dangerous, coiled stillness. He glanced at her, and even in the dark, he could see the change. He knew he had to move. He couldn't let them get closer. He couldn't let them see her face. Before she could lift the shotgun, before she could make a sound, Rowan stepped out from the cleft, his good hand raised, palm out. "That's enough, Lyle," he said, his voice loud and clear, drawing all the attention. The two men spun, their hands flashing to the pistols at their hips. "Well, look who it is," Fitch said, his gun steady on Rowan's chest. "The ghost himself. Kincaid's gonna be mighty pleased. He's paying double for you alive. Black." Lyle's gaze, however, slid past Rowan, trying to pierce the shadows where Maeve hid. His lips were pulled back in a leer. "And he'll probably pay a bonus for the hen. What's the matter? Black shoulder hurting you. You look about 2 steps from falling over." "I'm just here for the water, boys," Rowan said, his voice easy, though his body was tensed. He took a small step, putting himself squarely between them and Maeve's hiding place. "You ain't here for anything but a rope." Fitch growled. He started to advance. He had a heavy, dark stick, maybe an axe handle, looped to his saddle. He let his pistol hang and grabbed the club instead. "Kincaid wants you breathing, but he didn't say how much." Rowan watched him, but his real focus was on Lyle. who was trying to circle wide to get a better angle on the rocks. "Stay put, Lyle," Rowan warned. It was the opening Fitch needed. As Rowan turned his head, Fitch surged forward and swung the heavy club in a flat, brutal arc. Rowan tried to bring his good arm up to block, but he was too slow, his body still stiff from the wound and the climb. The wood connected with his ribs with a sickening, solid thud that Maeve felt in her own chest. A sharp, explosive crack of air burst from Rowan's lungs. He stumbled, his face ashen, and dropped to one knee, clutching his side. He was vulnerable. Lyle laughed, raising his pistol. "Time to flush the bird," he said, aiming not at Rowan, but at the dark cleft. Boom! The roar of the 12-gauge was a physical thing, a concussive blast that slammed the air from the ridge. It was deafening. Maeve stepped out of the rocks, the shotgun hot and heavy in her hands, smoke acrid and sharp, coiled from the twin barrels. "What?" Lyle shrieked, his horse screaming and rearing, its eyes white with terror. She hadn't aimed at him. She hadn't aimed at Fitch. She had aimed at the ground, a single pace in front of Lyle's horse. The blast had torn a crater in the earth, sending a spray of hot pellets, rock chips, and ash into the horse's face. Lyle was thrown from his balance, fighting the panicked, bucking animal. Fitch's own horse shied violently, snorting, backing away from the woman and the gun. Maeve stood planted, her feet firm on the earth she had just saved. She worked the lever, the smooth, metallic shuck-shuck echoing in the sudden silence, the spent red shell ejected, spinning onto the embers, and she fed a new one into the chamber. She raised the gun, the barrel now pointing squarely between the two men. "The next one won't be in the dirt," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was low, flat, and colder than the spring water. Fitch and Lyle, their faces pale in the lantern light, fought to control their terrified mounts. They were riflemen, but at this range, against a double-barreled shotgun, they were meat. You crazy bitch," Fitch yelled, his voice cracking. "You'll hang for that." "This ain't over," Lyle screamed, finally hauling his horse's head down. He pointed a shaking finger, first at Maeve, then at Rowan, who was slowly, painfully getting to his feet. "Kincaid will hear about this. He'll have the law on you. We'll be back, and we'll have a warrant. A legal warrant from Judge Pettigrew in 3 Cedars. He'll see you both strung up for this." "Get out," Maeve said. The two men didn't need to be told again. They wheeled their horses, digging in their spurs, and thundered back down the ridge, their panic and their shouted curses swallowed by the vast, dark valley. The silence that fell was absolute. Maeve stood, the shotgun barrel still hot, and began to shake. The adrenaline drained away, leaving her knees weak, her body vibrating. Rowan was leaning on the spade, his face a mask of sweat, his breathing shallow and ragged. She ran to him, the shotgun lowering. "Rowan, he hit you. Where?" "Ribs," he gasped, clutching his side. "Cracked, I think. Just cracked." He looked at her, a strange, pained smile twisting his lips. That was good shooting." "They'll be back," she said, the words tumbling out, her voice tight with a new, colder fear. "They meant it. A warrant. The judge. Rowan. They'll bring the law. They'll bring the whole town." "Yes," he said, pushing himself upright, his face pale in the light of the embers. "They will." "We have to go," she said, grabbing his arm. "Now, we have to pack. We can take the cows, take what water we can carry. We can go north, to Oregon. We can't fight a judge. Rowan, we have to run." It was the old instinct. "Run! Flee!" "Maeve!" He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong, forcing her to be still. "Maeve, look at me!" She met his gaze, her eyes wide with panic. "If we run, he wins," he said, his voice intense. "He gets this land. He gets this water. He gets your ranch. That warrant won't be for assault. It'll be a foreclosure. He'll claim you abandoned the property. He'll take this entire valley, just like he planned. But we'll be alive." She cried. "Will we?" he countered, his voice rough. "Living how I'll be a wanted murderer, and you'll be the woman who ran with me, a fugitive." Is that a life? Or do we stay and we fight? How? She demanded, gesturing wildly at the dark, empty land. With my shotgun and a spring they ought already know about. With the truth, he said, his voice gaining a hard strength. They gave us the answer. They're coming with legal paper. That means they're still afraid of the real law. They just think they own it. We need proof. And we need public opinion. We have to fight them with paper. We don't have time. We make time. He said, we have to split up. No. The word was out of her mouth before she could think. We must, he insisted, his grip tightening on her hand. They'll be back by noon, with the judge's ink still wet on that paper. So we have to be faster. You know this land. You go back to the ranch, now. You get the shovel. You dig a ditch from that spring all the way to your trough. I don't care how you do it. You get that water flowing. Then you ride to your neighbor. Enoch Daly, she whispered. Enoch Daly. He repeated. You bring him to your ranch. You show him the water. You show him your cows drinking it. You make him a witness. Maeve, a witness that this water was flowing. On your land. Before Kincaid's men and their false warrant ever showed up, you get his name on a piece of paper. That's how you save your claim. A spark of desperate, angry hope lit in her. It was a plan. It was something. And where are you going? Town, he said, his jaw set. 3 Cedars. She recoiled. You're insane. They'll hang you. Fitch and Lyle will be there. They will, he agreed. But I'm the map. Remember, and I'm the proof. They're coming for me here. The last place they'll look is in their own town. I have to get to that post office. I have to send a telegram. Not to Judge Pettigrew. Over his head, to the circuit marshal in Boise. I'll tell him about Kincaid, the frame-up, the water. I'll name names. Rowan, it's suicide. It's the only way, he said. We fight him with his own weapons, paper, and the law. Now, we have to go. Dawn is coming. They scrambled back to the cabin. The sky in the east just a faint, bruised purple. They moved with a new, frantic energy. He was stuffing his few things into his pack when she stopped him. Your shoulder, the bandage is soaked, and your ribs. It's fine, he grunted, wincing as he bent. It's not. Sit. Her voice was the one she'd used to stitch him. It brooked no argument. He sat at the small table, the lamp throwing their shadows long against the walls. He pulled his torn shirt off, hissing as it peeled away from his skin. The stitches on his shoulder were intact, but the skin around his ribs was already a map of angry, dark purple. She got her tin, a fresh strip of rag. Her hands were quick, efficient, cleaning the grime from his skin, checking the stitches. But this time, it was different. Her fingers, as she wrapped the new, clean bandage around his shoulder, were not just a nurse's. They were gentle. They lingered, just for a moment, on the warm, tanned skin of his good shoulder. He watched her face, not her hands. He watched the fierce concentration in her eyes, the smudge of soot on her cheek, the set of her jaw. She finished, tying the knot. Her hand rested on his shoulder. Be careful, she whispered. You too, he said, his voice low. She looked up. Their eyes met and held. The long, silent look held everything. The fear of the men on the ridge, the miracle of the spring, the hesitant, smoky kiss, the impossible, terrifying hope that was growing between them. He stood, towering over her. He put his good hand on her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away the smudge of soot. He leaned down. This was not the kiss at the spring. That had been relief, a shared discovery. This was a promise. It was a vow in the face of the enemy. It was short, firm, and warm. It was a kiss that said, I will come back. He pulled away, his eyes still on hers. Get Enoch Daly. Show him the water. Send that telegram, she replied, her voice finding its own strength. He nodded. A single, sharp movement. He slung his pack, hissing as the strap crossed his bruised ribs, and picked up his knife. He walked to the door and paused. looking back at her one last time, a woman of soot and steel, holding a shotgun in the dawn light. Then he was gone, a limping shadow swallowed by the gray. Heading east toward town, Maeve stood for a full minute. Then she barred the door, picked up her husband's spade, and walked out into the new day. She had a ditch to dig. Three Cedars was not a town. It was a trading post that had festered, a single dusty street of false-fronted buildings baking in the heat, a carbuncle on the height of the basin. Today, it was busier than usual. Kincaid had called his flock. A large, hand-painted sign was nailed to the front of the Silver Slipper Saloon, Silver Basin Drought Relief Meeting Donation, all ranchers welcome. Rowan Black kept his head down. The brim of an old, battered hat he'd found in Maeve's barn pulled low, shadowing his face. He had spent 20 minutes behind the livery, hissing in pain, as he used his heavy knife and a sliver of lye soap to shave his beard. The face that looked back at him from a cracked piece of mirror was a stranger's, younger, harder, his jaw set, his gray eyes cold and alert. The disguise was thin, but it was all he had. He'd traded his fur capote for a worn-out canvas duster, and he looked like any other broken-down trapper come to town to drink his losses. His ribs were a solid, agonizing band of fire. Every breath was a choice. The saloon was loud, the air thick with the smell of stale beer, unwashed men, and a desperate, false cheer. This was not a meeting of ranchers. It was a wake. At the back, past the long, scarred bar, the doors to the card room were thrown open. Rowan saw Otis Kincaid. He was not what Rowan had expected. He was small, impeccably dressed in a dark wool suit despite the heat, with a neat, trimmed beard and wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked like a preacher, or a schoolteacher. He was circulating, a glass of whiskey in one hand, a sheaf of papers in the other. Rowan moved to the bar, his left arm held close to his body, his right hand never far from the knife at his belt. He ordered a beer he wouldn't drink, paying with one of the few coins he had. He kept his back to the wall, his eyes on the reflection in the bar mirror. He watched Kincaid's operation. It was smooth. Kincaid would console a rancher, his voice full of sympathy. He'd point to the drought, to the failing land. He'd offer a way out, a donation to the relief fund, in exchange for which Kincaid's company would generously assume the rancher's debt, his water rights, his land, a signature, here, and the pain would be over. A man at the bar, his face flushed with whiskey and importance, was talking loudly to the bartender. He was small and weasel-faced, wearing a green visor and ink stains on his cuffs. "It's a masterpiece, I tell you, Sam," the man bragged, tapping a small, leather-bound box. "The boss, Mr. Kincaid, he wanted it perfect, a new seal for the water board. Just like the official one in Boise, he says it makes the transfers look proper, more comforting for the folks." Wilbur Pike, Kincaid's clerk. Rowan filed the name. A forgery. Kincaid wasn't just buying the land, he was creating a false legal body to rubber-stamp the theft. "And Judge Pettigrew?" Sam the bartender asked, his voice low. Wiping a glass, Pike laughed, a high, nervous sound. "The judge is presiding over the donation table. Isn't he? He finds the new seal to be a model of civic efficiency." That was enough. Rowan slid off the stool. Leaving the beer untouched, he moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the door. As he passed the card room, his eyes met Kincaid's. For a fraction of a second, the two men looked at each other. Kincaid's polite smile faltered. He saw, not a drunk trapper, but something he recognized. Rowan saw the calculating, empty coldness behind the spectacles. Rowan nodded, a simple gesture, as if acknowledging a fellow citizen, and walked out into the blinding, dusty sunlight. The post office was at the far end of the street, combined with the general store. The air inside smelled of coffee beans, new canvas, and the sharp, metallic tang of the telegraph key. The operator, a young man named Howard, looked bored. "One message," Rowan said, his voice a low rasp. He put a silver dollar on the counter, a massive expense. "To the circuit marshal, Boise. Howard's eyebrows went up. Boise, that's federal. Mister. And it's long. It'll cost you. I know what it'll cost. Rowan said, Send it. Now. Urgent. He dictated the words. His mind clear. His voice flat. To Marshall Burnham, Boise Circuit. Stop. Otis Kincaid. Railroad broker. Engaged in criminal conspiracy, 3-seaters. Stop. Extorting water rights from ranchers. Silver Basin. Under cover of drought. Stop. Using forged legal documents and a false seal. Stop. Judge Pettigrew complicit. Stop. I'm witness. Stop. Kincaid framed me for freight murder to silence me. Stop. Warrant for my arrest is fraudulent. Stop. Urge immediate federal intervention. Signed, Rowan Black. Guide. Howard's fingers, which had been tapping idly, were now frozen over the key. He was pale. Mister, that's treason. What you're saying. It's the truth. Rowan said. He pushed the dollar forward. Does he have a name? Who? Your witness. The one who has to sign that he heard me say it. Howard's eyes widened. He licked his lips. Me, I'm the witness. By law. Then send it, Howard, and sign your name as witness. When the marshal comes, you're the first man he'll talk to. You want to be on Kincaid's side of the line. Or the law's. Howard swallowed, his eyes darting to the saloon, visible across the street. He looked back at Rowan's cold, gray eyes. He turned, his back stiff, and his fingers began to fly. The key, chattering, a frantic, desperate call for help. Rowan didn't wait. He stepped back out into the sun. He had done his part. Now he just had to vanish. He turned toward the alley between the store and the livery. Black. The voice was hard. Official. Rowan froze. He turned, slowly. Sheriff Bram Harlan was standing not 10 feet away, his hand on his gun. Harlan was a big man, his gut swelling over a fancy, silver-buckled belt. He was Kincaid's man, bought and paid for. 2 other men, Fitch and Lyle, were emerging from the saloon, their face dark with triumph. They fanned out, cutting off the street. I knew it was you, Harlan said. His eyes narrowed. Saw you from my window. It was the scar. Rowan looked down. His right hand, his good hand. A long white scar ran from his wrist to his knuckle, a souvenir from a bar fight in Cheyenne. He'd forgotten it. You're a long way from Boise, Rowan, Harlan said, unholstering his pistol. And you're under arrest, for murder. You know that's a lie. Harlan, Rowan said, his voice quiet. He didn't move. He just watched. Truth is what the judge says it is. Harlan sneered. And the judge says you're a killer. Now, hands up, nice and slow. Fitch and Lyle were grinning, their hands on their own guns. It was a trap. All right, Bram, Rowan said. He raised his left arm, slowly, hissing as if in great pain. The shoulder. It's bad. He began to raise his right hand, the one with the scar. He raised it up, level with his face, and then, in a motion so fast it blurred, he threw the handful of fine red dust he'd been clenching in his fist since he'd left the post office. Harlan screamed, a high, surprised sound. As the grit and alkali dust hit his eyes, he fired his pistol, a single, blind shot that went wide, splintering the post office door. Rowan didn't wait. He lunged, not at Harlan, but at the alley. He's running, Lyle yelled. After him. Rowan was hurt, his ribs screaming, but fear was a powerful fuel. He rounded the corner into the narrow, trash-filled alley. A dead end, a 10-foot wooden fence. He heard their boots thundering behind him. He didn't turn. He put his good foot on a rotten crate, grabbed the top of the fence, and hauled himself up, his wounded shoulder shrieking, his ribs threatening to burst from his skin. He swung a leg over just as Fitch and Lyle skidded to a stop below him. Get him! Get him! Harlan bellowed, stumbling in, wiping his streaming, blinded eyes. Rowan dropped, landing hard in the livery stable's back lot, a cloud of foul-smelling hay and manure. He landed on his wounded side, and the world went white with pain. He fought for breath, on his hands and knees. "He's in the stable," he heard Harlan struggling with the fence. Rowan staggered to his feet. He ran, not out the front, but into the darkness of the stable itself. He ducked into an empty stall. He heard Harlan crash into the yard. "Check the stalls." "He's in here. He's trapped." Rowan grabbed a heavy horse blanket and waited, his body pressed against the rough wood, his knife in his hand. Harlan, his eyes still red and weeping, kicked the stall door open. "Got you! You!" Rowan threw the heavy, foul blanket over the sheriff's head. Harlan yelled, muffled, swatting at the darkness. Rowan didn't go for the gun. He stepped in, his good shoulder driving hard into Harlan's solar plexus. The air left the big man in a single, explosive woof as Harlan doubled over, gasping. Rowan brought his good hand, the one holding the knife, around. He used the heavy pommel of the knife, not the blade, striking Harlan once, hard, at the base of his skull. The sheriff grunted and went limp, a dead weight. Rowan was breathing like a bellows. He grabbed the handcuffs from Harlan's belt. He rolled the sheriff over, dragged him into the stall, and cuffed his hands behind his back. Securing the chain to the iron ring used for tethering horses, he shoved a wad of straw into Harlan's mouth for a gag. He was just finishing when he heard Fitch and Lyle enter the front of the stable. "Sheriff Black, where are you?" Rowan didn't run. He picked up Harlan's fallen hat. He put it on. He picked up Harlan's gun belt, his pistol still in its holster. He stepped out of the stall, into the shadows. "Sheriff," Fitch's voice was nervous. Rowan walked, his limp pronounced, his back to them. He walked toward the rear door, where the sun was a bright, blinding rectangle. "Hey!" Lyle yelled. "Is that ain't Harlan." Rowan didn't look back. He burst out into the sunlight, tossing the gun belt, and ran. He cut behind the assay office, slid between two houses, and was gone, melting back into the parched, indifferent land that was his only ally. At that exact moment, 50 miles away. Maeve Hollis drove her spade into the earth. The work was torture. The ground was stone. Her hands were raw, bleeding. Her back a single knot of fire, but the spring was flowing, and she had a ditch to dig. She was near collapse when she heard the horse. She spun, grabbing her shotgun. An old man on a mule, his beard white and tobacco-stained, was watching her from the ridge. Enoch Daly. "God almighty! Maeve!" he called, his voice a dry rasp. "What in hell are you doing trying to bury a body, or dig one up?" "I'm digging for my life. Enoch!" She yelled back, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fury. "And maybe yours. Get down here." He dismounted, his joints popping, and came to inspect her work. He saw the shallow, 3-mile ditch, a pathetic scratch in the dirt, but then he saw the head of it. He saw the new, wet mud. He saw the steady, miraculous trickle of water. He knelt, just as she had, and touched it. He tasted it. "This is Willow Fork," he whispered, his old eyes wide. "My grandfather told me. I thought it was a lie." "It's not a lie," Maeve said, leaning on the spade, her body trembling. "And Otis Kincaid wants it. He's coming for it today, with a warrant from the judge, claiming this land is abandoned, claiming this water is his." Enoch's face darkened. He hated Kincaid. Kincaid held paper on him, too. "I need a witness. Enoch," Maeve said, her voice raw. "I need you to swear, on paper, that you saw me, Maeve Hollis, on this land, working this land, and that you saw this water flowing on this date, before any warrant was served, before Kincaid could steal it." Enoch Daly looked at the water. He looked at Maeve, a woman he'd only ever known as a quiet, beaten-down widow, now covered in mud and fire. "Get your book, girl," he said, his voice a low growl. "Get that ledger Kincaid wrote his name in. I'll sign, and I'll date it, and I'll get 2 more ranchers to sign before sundown. Let that bastard Kincaid come. We'll show him what abandoned looks like." That night, they were separate. Rowan was hidden in a rocky cleft 3 miles out of town, his body a symphony of pain. He watched the lights of 3 Cedars, a hateful yellow smear in the darkness. He thought of the telegraph key, chattering in the silence. He thought of Maeve, alone, and his hand tightened around his knife. Maeve was on her porch, her own body screaming, the shotgun across her lap. She was not looking at the town. She was looking at the dark line of Dead Man Ridge. She thought of a man, limping, hunted, walking into the lion's den for her. The distance between them was miles, but they had never been closer. The longing was a physical ache, sharper than Rowan's ribs, deeper than Maeve's exhaustion. The fight was coming. Dawn would bring it, and they would face it. Not as two, but as one. The sun rose on a battlefield. It did not look like one. It was just a dusty ranch yard, baking in the new, fierce heat of the morning. But the lines were drawn. In the center of the yard, Maeve had dragged her heavy kitchen table. On it, open for the world to see, was Jedediah's ledger. Next to it, a single sheet of paper, an inkwell, and a pen. And beside that, her loaded 12-gauge shotgun. She was not alone. Enoch Daly sat on the edge of the porch, his old rifle across his knees. Two other ranchers, Tom Sellers and Abe Johnson, whom Enoch had roused before dawn, stood by the new, muddy, miraculous ditch that now ran from the base of the ridge clear to the brimming water trough. They held their own rifles, their faces grim. They, too, had paper with Kincaid. They, too, were being strangled. Maeve's stand was their own. The new water, a thin but steady stream, gurgled in the ditch. The two cows were drinking, their thirst a thing of the past. The sight of that water was a defiant, living thing in the face of the drought. They were waiting. They did not have to wait long. Just after 10, they came, a cloud of red dust rising from the east. It was not the two men from the night before. This was an entourage. Otis Kincaid rode in the lead, not on a horse, but in a smart, black buggy, as if he were going to a Sunday social. Beside him sat the man Maeve recognized as Judge Pettigrew, a heavy man with a drinker's jowly face. Fitch and Lyle rode escort, their rifles unslung from their saddles, their faces smug behind them. Two more hired guns, and a wagon carrying heavy tools and a large, newly painted sign, property of the Silver Basin Water Board. Kincaid brought his buggy to a halt, a look of mild, clerical annoyance on his face as he saw the armed men. "Mrs. Hollis," he called, his voice polite, carrying in the still air. He stepped down from the buggy, brushing dust from his dark suit. "And Mr. Daly, gentlemen, I'm so glad you are all here to bear witness. It saves us a great deal of trouble." Judge Pettigrew heaved himself out of the buggy. He unrolled a scroll, heavy with seals. "By the authority of the Idaho Territory and the Circuit Court of Three Cedars," he began, his voice a self-important boom, "I am here to serve this writ of seizure on the abandoned property known as the Hollis Ranch." "It's not abandoned," Maeve said, her voice quiet, but it carried, cutting through the judge's bluster. She was standing behind the table, her hands resting on the open ledger. Kincaid's polite smile faltered. He looked at Maeve, then at the full trough, then at the fresh, wet ditch. His eyes narrowed. "Abandoned," he repeated. "And its resources, specifically its well and any other sources, are to be capped and placed under the protective stewardship of the Silver Basin Water Board, by order of this court." "This court," Maeve said, her gaze steady, "is a long way from its courthouse." "Insolence," Pettigrew snapped. "You will respect and this land is not abandoned," Maeve continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "I have witnesses." She tapped the ledger. "Enoch, Abe, Tom, you've all seen the book. You've all seen the water I dug. You've all seen me working this land. As of this morning. Sign it," she said, not to Kincaid, but to the ranchers. Enoch Daly was first. He walked to the table, took the pen, and with a scratchy, deliberate hand, signed his name to the paper she had drawn up, attesting to the date, the water, and her claim. Abe Johnson and Tom Sellers followed, their movements firm, defiant. Kincaid's face, for the first time, lost its calm. A dark, Angry flush crept up his neck. That is meaningless. A theatrical, childish gesture. You are signing a worthless document. I have a court order, signed by a judge. And I have a ledger, Maeve said, her voice cold as the spring water. Also with your name in it, Mr. Kincaid. A loan, with interest that would choke a horse. And a note, your note, about how this drought was your friend, about how you would call the debt when the basin cracks. It seems you've come to call your debt. There was a dead, stunned silence. Enoch and the other ranchers stared, not at Maeve, but at Kincaid. The polite pretense was gone, ripped away. They were not here for a donation. They were here to watch a theft. Lyle! Kincaid snapped, his voice a venomous hiss. Fitch, seize the well, cap it, and take that book. Lyle, his face red with fury at being exposed, his hatred for the woman who had bested him radiating like heat, strode forward. My pleasure, boss. He sneered at Maeve. You and your paper. You're done. He lunged, his hand grabbing not for the gun, but for the ledger. He was going to rip it from her. Maeve moved. She did not grab her shotgun. Her left hand, the one that had stitched Rowan's wound, shot out and clamped down on Lyle's wrist as it hit the table. At the same instant, her right hand, the one that had dug the ditch, picked up the heavy, iron-bound inkwell and slammed it down on the back of his hand. Pinning it to the ledger, Lyle roared, a sound of pure, shocked pain. Maeve leaned forward, her face inches from his, her voice a low, vicious whisper that only he and Kincaid could hear. You touch my paper, she hissed, her eyes like chips of blue-gray ice. You touch my land. You so much as think about touching me. And I will end you. I will not use a gun. I will use my hands. And you will pay. Lyle, his face white, his hand crushed and bleeding ink, was frozen. His bravado utterly shattered by this woman of cold, quiet fury. Get her off me, he shrieked at Kincaid. Fitch was raising his rifle. Enoch Daly and the other ranchers were raising theirs. The yard was a tinderbox, a single second from a bloodbath. That'll be enough. The voice was not from either group. It was new. It came from the ridge. Everyone froze. A line of riders, 6 deep, was cresting the hill, coming down toward the ranch. They were not ranchers. They were not Kincaid's men. They rode in a disciplined, tight formation. In the lead was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a long duster, his face hard, a silver star pinned to his chest. And beside him, on a horse that looked half dead but was still moving, was Rowan Black. He was clean. He was armed, a pistol belt strapped to his waist. His ribs were clearly taped tight under his shirt. But he sat tall in the saddle, his gray eyes fixed, not on Maeve, not on Kincaid, but on the man with the star. Marshal Burnham, Rowan said, his voice carrying, identifying his companion. United States Circuit Marshal. Kincaid's face went from red to a sickly, mottled white. Judge Pettigrew looked as if he was about to be sick. Burnham and his 2 deputies, followed by Rowan, rode straight into the center of the yard, creating a new, impassable line between the 2 groups. Howard, the telegraph operator, was with them, looking terrified but resolute. Otis Kincaid, Burnham said, his voice like gravel. He didn't wait for an answer. I have a federal warrant for your arrest and for the search of your offices in the Silver Slipper Saloon. This is an outrage. Kincaid sputtered, finding his voice. This is a local land dispute. You have no jurisdiction, this man. He pointed a shaking finger at Rowan. Is a wanted murderer. I demand you arrest him. We'll get to him, Burnham said, his eyes cold. He swung down from his horse. As for my jurisdiction is the United States, and the United States mail, which you, sir, have been using to defraud, and the United States Telegraph, which you have been using to conspire. I have a witness. He nodded at Howard. Mr. Howard here was kind enough to testify as to the messages you've been sending. He pulled a small, leather-bound box from his saddlebag. the one Wilbur Pike had been bragging about. And my deputies found this in your safe. A forged federal seal for a water board that doesn't exist, along with a very detailed payoff ledger. It was too much for Fitch. He had seen his boss, his world, collapse in 30 seconds. He was a cornered rat. His eyes, wild with panic, flicked to Kincaid, to the marshal, to Rowan. He saw the man who had gotten away. "You!" he screamed, and his hand flashed to his gun. He was fast. Rowan was faster. Rowan, who had been sitting his horse, tense and ready, drew the pistol from the holster Burnham had given him. The crack of his shot was simultaneous with the sound of Fitch's gun clearing leather. Fitch screamed, not in pain, but in shock. His hat, the one he had been wearing, was gone. Blasted from his head by a single, perfectly placed shot, Rowan, his face a mask of stone, his pistol smoking in his hand, said nothing. The message was clear. I didn't. Fitch dropped his pistol as if it were on fire, his hands shooting into the air, his face pale. "Arrest that man!" Kincaid shrieked, his voice breaking. "He just fired on... He's a killer! He's the killer!" Marshal Burnham turned, slowly, to face Kincaid. His voice was soft, and all the more dangerous for it. "A killer? You say... You know, Mr. Kincaid. The most interesting thing happened on our way out of town." He walked his horse closer, forcing Kincaid to step back. "My deputies found a man, bound and gagged, in the livery stable. A big man, wearing a sheriff's badge." Kincaid stopped breathing. "Sheriff Bram Harlan," the marshal continued, his voice conversational. "He was very grateful, very talkative. He was so talkative, in fact, that he told us exactly where to find your real ledger, the one you keep in the false bottom of your cigar box, not the one you leave in the safe, the one that lists the payoffs to Judge Pettigrew here. He told us everything. Kincaid, about the freight job, about the frame-up, about the bounty you placed, in exchange for consideration as a federal witness." Judge Pettigrew made a low, choking sound and sat down, hard, in the dust. The standoff was over. Kincaid was broken. "Cuff him," Burnham said to his deputies. "Cuff the judge. Cuff Lyle, Fitch, and the rest of these water board employees." As the deputies moved in, the yard descended into a quiet, stunned chaos of men being disarmed and bound. Rowan finally swung down from his horse, wincing as his feet hit the ground, his ribs screaming. He looked at Maeve. She was still standing behind the table, her hand, covered in ink and Lyle's blood, still resting on the ledger. Her eyes were locked on his. They said everything. Burnham, seeing the look and seeing the armed ranchers, raised his hand. "Hold, this is not over. This is not a lynching. This is the law. My authority says this whole mess gets sorted, proper. Judge Pettigrew," he sneered, "is indisposed, so I am declaring a territorial circuit hearing. We will convene tomorrow, at dawn, at the Stagecoach Depot. Everyone will have their say. Kincaid, you will be tried. Rowan Black, you will testify. And you, Mrs. Hollis, will present your claim." He looked at the ranchers. "Until then, my deputies and I will secure the prisoners. This ranch is under federal protection for the night. Everyone, stand down." The long day bled into a tense, exhausted twilight. The deputies set up a perimeter, guarding the prisoners, who were now tied in Kincaid's wagon. The ranchers, seeing that the fight was over, agreed to return at dawn to bear witness, and rode home. The yard was finally, blessedly, quiet. Maeve and Rowan were left, standing in the wreckage of the day. The table was overturned. The ink spilled. Maeve went, mechanically, to the fire pit. She rebuilt the fire, her hands shaking so much it took her 3 tries to strike the match. The night's chill was setting in. Rowan came and stood behind her, not touching. She stood up, her back to the new, small flame. She looked at him, the soot on his face from town, the grim set of his jaw, the way he held his side, the tension, the adrenaline, the terror of the last 48 hours. finally broke. It was not a dam breaking, as it had been at the spring. This was a slow, painful crumbling. A single tear, hot and impossible, traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He saw it. He took one step, and she was in his arms. She collided with his chest, her hands grabbing the fabric of his shirt, her face pressed against his good shoulder, her body finally, giving into the shaking. It was not a sob. It was a silent, violent tremor of a wire stretched too tight for too long. Rowan's good arm, his right arm, came around her, holding her with a fierce, protective, desperate strength. His other hand, the one with the scar, came up, his fingers lacing into her hair, holding the back of her head, pressing her close. He held her as if he were holding her up, as if he were the only thing keeping her from collapsing into the dust. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, smoke and lye soap and courage, and just held on. They didn't speak. There were no words for this. No words for what they had faced. No words for the kiss at the spring, or the fight at the table, or the shot that had saved his life. There was only this, standing in the light of their small fire. Two people, battered and scarred, who had been alone, were, for this one night, a fortress. They were a defensive, burning line against the darkness, and they held each other, as if they would never let go. The stagecoach depot at Three Cedars had never seen such a crowd. By dawn, it seemed every rancher, farmer, and homesteader from a 100-mile radius had descended on the town. They came on horseback, in wagons, and on foot, drawn by the most potent forces in the West, rumored gold and stolen water. This was about water. It was about their survival. The depot platform had been turned into a makeshift courthouse. Marshal Burnham, his face like carved granite, had taken the station master's desk and dragged it into the center. He, not Judge Pettigrew, was presiding. He had declared this a federal hearing, citing conspiracy, mail fraud, and the compromising of a territorial court, which put the entire matter under his jurisdiction as the highest-ranking, uncorrupted lawman present. Kincaid, Pettigrew, Fitch, Lyle, and the other hired guns were seated on a wooden bench, their hands cuffed, looking pale and disheveled in the harsh morning light. Two deputies stood guard over them. Rowan and Maeve stood on the other side of the platform, near Enoch Daly and the ranchers. Maeve was wearing her only good dress, a dark blue calico, her hair pulled back so tightly it emphasized the fierce, proud lines of her face. Rowan was at her side, his ribs taped, his face grim, his gray eyes missing nothing. Burnham began. He did not speak with a lawyer's flourish. He spoke like a blacksmith, with heavy, factual blows. He held up the ledger from Kincaid's safe. "Exhibit 1, he said, his voice booming over the silent, watchful crowd. "A ledger detailing payoffs to Judge Horace Pettigrew here, for the express purpose of signing fraudulent warrants of seizure." A low, angry murmur rippled through the ranchers. Pettigrew seemed to shrink, his face the color of old dough. Burnham then held up the small, elegant leather box. Exhibit 2, a forged seal, bearing the false title of the Silver Basin Water Board, an entity that does not exist, used to create these. He tossed a sheaf of Kincaid's false writs onto the table. "Paper, designed to steal your land under the color of law." The murmur grew louder. "And finally," Burnham said, "I have the sworn testimony of two men, Mr. Wilbur Pike, clerk to Mr. Kincaid, who has confessed to the creation of these documents." He nodded to Howard, the telegraph operator. "And I have the testimony of Mr. Howard, who has confirmed the sending of fraudulent messages. But most of all, I have the full confession of Sheriff Bram Harlan." He turned his cold eyes on Kincaid. "Sheriff Harlan, in exchange for testimony, has detailed a conspiracy to rob a federal freight shipment, to murder its guides, and to frame one man to cover the trail. A man Mr. Kincaid knew was the only one who understood the true water sources of this valley, the man he needed to silence. Otis Kincaid, you are charged with conspiracy, fraud, and incitement to murder." Kincaid sat silent, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked like a man who simply could not comprehend that his neat, orderly world of paper and ink had collapsed. "Mrs. Hollis," Burnham said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Please step forward." Maeve walked to the desk. She was not afraid. She was past fear. She placed Jedediah's ledger on the table. "Tell us what happened," Burnham said. Maeve turned, not to the marshal, but to the crowd, to her neighbors. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried in the morning air. "We have been told," she began, "that we are victims of a drought, that the land is dying, that we must give up, abandon our homes." She pointed to Kincaid. "This man told us he was our friend, that he would relieve our burden." She opened her husband's ledger, her finger finding the page. "This is his friendship, a loan, with interest that is a noose, and a note, his own hand. This drought is our friend. We'll call the debt when the basin cracks." She looked up, her eyes, not calm, but burning with a cold, righteous fire that transfixed the crowd. "The basin did not crack. Mr. Kincaid. He cracked it. He choked our rivers. He paid to have our water cut off, and he waited. And when he came for my land 2 days ago, he called it abandoned. But it was not abandoned. I was there. I was working it. I was digging." She pointed, not to the ridge, but to the ranchers. "Enoch Daly saw me. Abe Johnson saw me. Tom Sellers saw me. They saw me. And they saw the water." "What water, Mrs. Hollis?" Burnham asked, his voice gentle. "The water that Kincaid tried to hide." She said, "The water that has always been there. The water from Willow Fork. I dug a ditch, 3 miles long, with my own hands, and it is flowing now. It is in my trough. My cows are drinking. The drought is a lie." A wave of sound hit the platform. Men were standing, shouting, pointing at Kincaid. This was a truth they could understand. Water. Lies. "She's lying!" Kincaid suddenly shrieked, his composure finally, completely shattering. He lunged to his feet, fighting against his cuffs. "She's a witch. It's some trick. That water is mine. It's all mine. I bought it. I paid for it. This whole valley, this whole ignorant, dirty valley, belongs to me. I have the paper." The crowd surged. A single, angry body. Men raised their fists. "Thief. Liar. Hang him. Silence." Burnham roared. His deputies drawing their pistols, not to threaten the crowd, but to protect the prisoners from them. "This is a court, not a mob. Sit down. Kincaid, you have just confessed. Thank you." He turned to Rowan, who had been standing silent, his arms crossed, watching. "Mr. Black, you are the subject of a warrant, now proven false, but you have a part in this. What is your testimony?" Rowan stepped forward. He did not look at Kincaid. He looked at the marshal, and at the ranchers. "My name is Rowan Black. I was a guide," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I was hired by Mr. Kincaid to guide his freight wagon. I was good at my job. Too good. I knew this land. I knew its secrets. I knew about Willow Fork." His face darkened. "Kincaid offered me a share, a large one, to help him, to lose the wagon, to lead it into an ambush, to help him frame another man. I said no." He paused, and his gaze found Maeve. "But I didn't stop him. I didn't report him. I took his money, and I agreed to guide the wagon, and to keep my mouth shut. I thought I could. I don't know what I thought." He looked back at the marshal. "I was a coward. I was greedy. I was the man who guided for the wrong side. The ambush. It was Kincaid's men, Fitch and Lyle. But they weren't there to frame someone else. They were there to kill me, to tie up the last loose end. They failed." He touched his shoulder. "What I did, guiding for him, that was a crime. I know that. But what I did after, discovering that spring, sending that telegram, that was me, trying to make it right. I can't be measured for the man I was 3 weeks ago. I asked the court, and I asked the good people of this basin to measure me by what I did, by what we did, in the last 3 days." He was done. He stepped back, standing beside Maeve. He did not look at her, but she could feel the rigid, pained line of his body next to hers. Marshal Burnham was silent for a long, heavy minute. He looked at the evidence. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Kincaid, who was now weeping. A small, broken man. "The findings of this court," Burnham declared, his voice ringing with finality, "are as follows. On the matter of Otis Kincaid, Horace Pettigrew, Fitch, Dorian Lyle, and their associates, I find them guilty. Guilty of conspiracy, federal mail fraud, forgery, incitement to murder, and attempting to steal the land and water of the good people of this territory. Their assets are seized. All debts held by Kincaid are null and void." A roar went up from the crowd, a sound of pure, explosive relief. "All false warrants are hereby destroyed." Burnham continued, ripping Kincaid's writ in half. "And the water of Silver Basin, specifically the source at Willow Fork, is recognized as the common property of this community, to be shared by all." The celebration was deafening. Men were throwing their hats in the air, embracing. Enoch Daly was crying, his face buried in his hands. Burnham held up his hand. "Silence, I am not finished." The crowd quieted. "On the matter of Rowan Black," Burnham said, his gaze settling on Rowan. "This court recognizes the duress under which he acted. It recognizes the bounty was fraudulent, and it recognizes that, without his testimony and his courage in entering this town, none of this would have been possible. His testimony and his service to this community have been noted. The warrant from 3 Cedars is nullified. All charges are dismissed." Maeve's hand, which had been clenched at her side, relaxed. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "However," Burnham continued, a small, practical look in his eye, "Mr. Black, Kincaid has friends, and a man who has lost this much, his shadow is long. This court advises that you make yourself scarce for a few weeks. Let the dust and the public opinion settle. Let my deputies clean this town up. Then your business is your own." It was a pardon and an exile, all in one. A practical, Western solution. "This hearing is concluded," Burnham said. He banged his hand on the desk like a gavel. The crowd surged forward, surrounding Maeve, surrounding Enoch. Everyone talking, shouting, laughing. Maeve was slapped on the back, her hand shaken by strangers. She was the hero of the basin. She was pressed and pulled, her gaze frantically searching. She found him. Rowan was not in the center of it. He was at the edge of the crowd, by the depot wall, his pack already at his feet. He was respecting the marshal's order. He was leaving. Maeve pushed her way through the joyous mob, her heart a cold stone. "Let me through. Excuse me." She burst free of the last group of ranchers and found herself standing in front of him. The depot was chaos behind her, a blur of noise and celebration. Here, in this small space, there was only silence. His face was a mask of pain, and not just from his ribs. He had saved the valley, and in doing so, had lost the only place he wanted to be. "So," she said, her voice small. "Boise, or Oregon," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The marshal's right. It's better for a while." "For a while," she repeated, the words hollow. He looked at her, at the woman who had fought beside him, who had saved him, who he had kissed. He wanted to say 1,000 things. He wanted to tell her she was the strongest, bravest person he had ever known. He wanted to tell her that her eyes, in the firelight, were the only map he ever wanted to read again. He said none of it. He reached out, his scarred, gentle hand, and placed it on her cheek. He leaned in, and in the middle of the crowded, chaotic depot, with the whole world celebrating, he pressed his forehead against hers. It was not a kiss. It was a brand. It was a silent, desperate, public acknowledgement. "I am yours. You are mine. Wait for me." She closed her eyes, her own hands coming up to rest on his chest, her fingers curling into his shirt. She could feel the rapid, painful beat of his heart, and he could feel the tremor that ran through her. "Rowan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Maeve," he breathed. He pulled back. His hand slid from her cheek. He shouldered his pack, the movement a pure, white-hot agony. He did not look back. He walked away from the celebration, a tall, limping, solitary figure, and disappeared down the dusty street, heading north. That night, Maeve did not go to the depot. She did not go to the saloon, where the ranchers were celebrating their new, free water. She went to the barn, and she pulled one of the 10 beaver pelts from the pile, the first payment. She took it, and the last of her good blankets, to the edge of the new field, where the tiny trickle of water from her ditch was already making the dead earth dark and soft. The air smelled of mud, and hope, and sarsaparilla. She spread the fur, soft and rich, on the damp ground. She sat, and she waited. But he was not there. She lay back, pulling the blanket over her, and looked at the stars. She thought of his forehead pressed against hers, a promise. She lay there, alone, on the rich, dark fur. She would wait. They had a promise to keep, a promise for when everything, truly, was theirs. The high summer of 1874 bled into a wet, hopeful autumn. The drought, Kincaid's drought, had broken not with a storm, but with a steady, persistent flow. The spring at Willow Fork, now channeled and managed by a cooperative of ranchers led by Enoch Daly, had been aptly named. The willows planted along its banks had taken root, their new, pale green leaves a vibrant, shocking color against the recovering red earth. 3 months had passed. Silver Basin was transformed. It was not a paradise, not a lush garden, but it was alive. The creek bed, once a ribbon of hot stones, now held a shallow, clear stream. Grass, the native, tough bunch grass of the high prairie, had returned, covering the scars of the fire and the drought. And where Maeve's ditch ran, a dark, rich line of green followed it, a testament to her labor. There was a new sound in the valley. It was not the wind, or the crackle of fire, or the lonely thud of a single axe. It was the sound of children's laughter. Enoch's grandchildren and the Sellers boys now had a place to water their ponies. They would ride up to the spring, which was now a wide, protected pool, and splash in the shallows, their voices echoing, a sound of a future reclaimed. They were safe, watched over by the entire valley. Maeve's ranch was the heart of this new life. It was no longer a place of stubborn, desperate survival. It was a hub. She was rebuilding. The old, soot-stained barn was being replaced. A new storehouse, built of fresh-sawn pine, was rising next to it. The air smelled of sawdust and new timber. Inside the cabin, which felt larger, brighter, the walls were clean, and on the main wall, where her husband's useless rifle had once hung, there was a new decoration, 10 prime beaver pelts, scraped, treated, and oiled by her own hands, were hung in a perfect, rich, dark fan. They were not for sale. They were not currency. They were a symbol. They were the price of a single night that had purchased an entire world. She was on the roof of the new storehouse, her hammer strikes even and sure. When she saw the rider, he was a long way off, a single speck coming from the north, not from the town. Her heart did not leap. It did not pound. It simply stopped. She froze, her hammer in her hand, the sun hot on her back. She had waited. Every day for 3 months. She had waited. Her hope a quiet, guarded ember. She had told herself he was gone, that the marshal's advice was permanent, that he had found a new life in Oregon. And she had gone on, building, working, her jaw set, her heart walled off. The rider was not fast. He was slow, methodical, like a man who knows his destination and is in no hurry to arrive, only to be there. She dropped the hammer. It clattered on the new shingles. She did not run. She climbed down the ladder, her knees suddenly weak, her hands, calloused and strong, suddenly trembling. She brushed the sawdust from her canvas trousers and stood in the middle of her yard, by the full, gurgling trough, and she waited. It took him 20 minutes. She watched every step of the horse, every line of his body. This was not the man who had collapsed at her gate. This was not the man who had kissed her in the smoke. This was a new man, forged from the other two. He was clean. He was wearing a new, simple cotton shirt, his dark hair cut. He had a mustache, neatly trimmed, which made him look older, more settled. He was still lean, his face browned by the sun, but the hunted, haunted look in his eyes was gone. They were just clear, gray and clear as the spring water. He was weary, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion from a long road. But it was the weariness of travel, not of fear. He reined in his horse, a good bay mare, not the half-dead creature he'd ridden out on. He just sat, looking at her. For a long, silent moment, he looked at her, standing straight and strong. He looked at the new storehouse, the full trough, the green ditch. He looked at the pelts, visible through the open cabin door. He swung down from the saddle. His movements were no longer stiff, no longer pained. His ribs had healed. His shoulder was strong. He was whole. "Maeve," he said. His voice was the same, a low, quiet rumble. "Rowan," she breathed. The name was a prayer, and a question, and a statement, all in one. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. He unslung his pack, and from it he took not a weapon, not a fur, but a piece of paper. It was an official document, heavy, bearing the new, legitimate seal of the Boise Circuit Court. He didn't hand it to her. He just held it out. "It's done," he said. "Kincaid's assets, the ones the marshal seized, the railroad stock, the freight lines, they're liquidated. Your bounty," she whispered. "Did you get it?" "A share," he said. "Enough for the horse. And this." He placed the paper, not in her hand, but on the edge of the trough. "It's a transfer, all of Kincaid's holdings, his false claims, his stock. It's all been transferred. It's the seed money, for the Silver Basin Water Cooperative. It's yours. It's Enoch's. It's the Valley's. You're the main signatory, Maeve. You own the paper now." She looked at the document, at her name, written in a clear, legal hand. She looked up at him, her eyes blurring, her throat tight. You came back to bring me a piece of paper." "I came back," he said, his voice low, "to see if you'd still have me, now that I'm not a murderer." He took a step closer, his gaze so intense it was a physical touch. "The marshal says the dust is settled. He says Kincaid's friends are gone. My name is clear." He looked at his own hands. The scar was still there. "I don't have a ring. Maeve, I don't have a ranch. All I have is what I know. All I have is my hands and this water. The cooperative will need a manager, someone to read the maps, to manage the flow, to make sure every ranch gets its share, every season." He finally met her eyes. "If you want me, if you'll have me, I'll stay. I'll stay. And I'll manage the water." She didn't answer with words. She couldn't. She took that one. Last step. The space that had separated them for 3 long months. And she put her hands on his chest. She pressed her face against the clean, sun-warmed cotton of his shirt. She just stood there, breathing him in. He was still for a moment, as if in shock, and then his arms, his strong, whole arms, came around her, and he held her. He held her like he had held her by the fire, a fierce, protective, grounding embrace. His face was buried in her hair, his breath a warm, steady thing against her. That evening, the new storehouse was not a workplace. It was a sanctuary. The sun was setting, a blaze of orange and violet, sending long, dusty shafts of light through the gaps in the new wall planks. The hayloft was full, the air sweet and warm. They sat on a pile of fresh-cut hay, not touching, just looking. They had shared a meal, bread and fresh beef, and water from the spring. They had talked of his journey, of her rebuilding, of the law. All the words were said. Now, there were no words left. He reached out, his hand open, palm up on the blanket between them. A simple, silent invitation. Maeve looked at his hand, the scarred, strong hand that had stitched her trough, that had fought for her, that had held her. She placed her own hand in his fingers closed around hers, lacing. A perfect, warm fit. He drew her, gently, toward him. She came, moving from her seat, to kneel in front of him. He did not pull her. He did not demand. He just held her hand. He raised his other hand to her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, the way he had at the spring. But this time, there was no smoke, no fear, only a deep, profound, quiet certainty. "Maeve Hollis," he whispered, his voice thick. "Rowan Black." She answered, her voice a tremor. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the chaste, smoky kiss of the spring. It was not the desperate, promising kiss of his departure. This was a kiss of arrival. It was deep and slow and sure. It was a kiss that said, "I am home." His lips were soft, firm, tasting of clean air and coffee. His mustache was a soft brush against her skin. He kissed her with a reverence that made her heart ache, as if he were memorizing her. Her hands came up, not to his chest, but to his face, her palms framing his jaw, her fingers in his hair. She kissed him back, pouring all the fear, all the loneliness, all the waiting, into that single, answering touch. He pulled her closer, his arms circling her waist, lifting her, settling her, so she was cradled against him, his one hand still linked with hers, the other spread wide and warm on the small of her back. She was not a widow. She was not a victim. She was chosen. She was seen. She was respected. And she was choosing, just as fiercely. In return, he broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, just as he had at the depot. But this time, their breath was calm, their bodies warm, their future stretched out before them, clear and bright as the water. He was breathing hard, a deep, slow rhythm that she felt in her own chest. His hand moved from her back, up to her shoulder, to her neck, his fingers stroking her skin, a touch that was both a question and a comfort. He made no move to go further. He just held her and breathed with her. She pulled back, just enough to see his eyes, dark and full of a deep, quiet fire in the sunset. She saw the question there, the respect he would not take. He would only accept what was offered. And Maeve, who had been offered 10 furs for a single night, gave him her answer. She brought his hand, the one linked with hers, to her lips, and kissed his scarred knuckles. Then she laid his hand over her heart, and with her other hand, she began, slowly, to unbutton his shirt. Later, much later, the stars were brilliant in the gaps in the roof. They lay in the sweet hay, tangled not in a desperate, ragged sheet, but under one of the heavy, soft beaver pelts. Her head was on his chest, his good, strong heart beating a steady, peaceful rhythm beneath her ear. His hand was in her hair, his fingers stroking, his breath even. It was a peace so profound, so complete, it felt more solid than the earth itself. It was the feeling of being utterly, completely, and finally, safe. The next morning, the sun rose on a celebration. Enoch Daly, Tom Sellers, Abe Johnson, and their families had all gathered. It was the first water ceremony, the official opening of the Silver Basin Cooperative. The main trough, Maeve's trough, had a red ribbon tied across it. Maeve stood in front, Rowan at her side. He was not in the front. He was just there, a quiet, solid presence at her shoulder. Enoch made a small speech. He thanked the marshal. He thanked the land, and then he looked at Maeve. "But most of all," he said, his voice thick, "we thank Mrs. Hollis, who saw what we were too blind to see, who fought when we were ready to fold. Maeve, the water is yours. Cut the ribbon." Maeve, her face flushed, took the knife that Rowan quietly offered her. She looked at the crowd, at her neighbors, at the children, splashing in the new, clean water, at the green land. She looked at Rowan, who was watching her, his eyes full of a pride so deep it almost broke her. She sliced the ribbon. The water, which had been diverted for a moment, gushed into the trough with a sound like a blessing. A cheer went up, loud and long, echoing off the ridge, in the middle of the noise, in the middle of the crowd. Rowan leaned in. He did not kiss her mouth. He pressed a light, firm, loving kiss to her forehead. A kiss of public promise, a husband's kiss. Maeve leaned into him, her hand finding his, her voice so low only he could hear it over the celebration. "One night," she whispered. "For 10 furs." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "And I received a lifetime." He squeezed her hand. "He offered 10 furs for a single night," he said, his voice a low rumble, completing the thought, echoing the title of their story. But the widow gave him far more. She had given him a home. She had given him a future. She had given him a reason. As the celebration continued, as Enoch started talking about a barn-raising dance, a new sound joined the laughter. It was the thud of a hammer. Rowan had picked it up and was walking toward the unfinished storehouse. Maeve smiled, picked up her own, and followed him. The sound of 2 hammers, striking in unison, echoed across the valley. They were not just building a storehouse. They were building a life, together. One sure, steady blow at a time. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, and let's connect. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give it a little extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more folks just like you.